So the Iranian response attacks are continuing. We've got the oil tanker that's been attacked off the coast of Oman, 4 injured. The biggest protest that I can detect from social media feeds and such like appear to be in Pakistan, and they seem to be quite widely spread in Pakistan, from Karachi to Skardu, where the UN office has been set alight. We heard briefly about that earlier in the programme. I believe Oman has been calling for Iran to cease its attacks. I'm joined by the editor-in-chief of the national news website, and that's Mina Al-Oraibi. Nice to see you, Mina. How concerned are you of these sort of revenge attacks from Iran against Middle Eastern nations? Do you expect this to continue to increase?
Thank you for having me. I'm concerned about the region and what happens next in terms of the chaos that we have been living in intermittently. I was speaking to an Iraqi friend of mine who lives here in Abu Dhabi, and like myself, I'm originally from Iraq. We both grew up in the 80s with an Iraq war, and at the time it was, much, much stronger than anything that's happening here in Abu Dhabi, and this idea that Iran, over 5 decades at different points, has struck different Arab countries. So there is that sense of where does this go and what happens with the Iranian regime. There is also a sense of what happens next in terms of what are Iran's actual capabilities. It's clear that they're using all their abilities to show that they're capable of striking. They have now struck 7 different countries, all the Gulf countries. Oman was the latest this morning, as you were saying. So all 6 Gulf countries, and Jordan has also been attacked. And so the idea is, how long can they continue? Is this a final push, or is there much more that they can do? With the ongoing Israeli and American attacks on Iran, you would expect that their capability to strike will be reduced over the coming few days, but it's hard to tell for sure. What is clear that the calculus of the regime is that this is a war that is existential, and so therefore they think that by striking as far out as they can, they're showing strength. But in reality, they're alienating the very countries that would be trying to work to a peaceful resolution.
I see that. Does that ultimately lead to more pressure, useful pressure, being applied to whatever replaces Ayatollah Khamenei? Could it ultimately lead to a positive pressure on Iran, I guess?
It really depends. When you say whatever replaces, Ayatollah Khamenei has now been killed, and of course the regime is putting together a new leadership. So if the regime stays in its current formulation and thinking and ideology, then no, actually it will show that no one can trust Iran in its current status as a neighbor, and it's shown that. In the future, could there be a change of government in Iran, an outlook where actually its position is completely different and wants to build peaceful ties in the region? Yes, of course. I mean, that is the ultimate hope, that you do have a government in Iran whose calculation is that it wants to have better regional ties, but also importantly, has good relations with its own citizens. Chaos in Iran is not good for anybody, and that's the concern, that ultimately we go into a longer-term war, domestic problems and civil strife inside of Iran that isn't emerging yet. But if there is a complete breakdown in Iran, what comes in its place? And I think that's why many people in this region were concerned about an American-Israeli strike that is not well thought out, and also that we don't know what the outcome would be.
The lack of a described plan, again, that troubles you. Yes, it troubles me. I'm gonna put myself right out on a limb here and possibly make myself sound absolutely ridiculous. But with Donald Trump's border peace bringing together many nations that have possibly previously had difficult or strained relations with the US in decades past, and this ambition to change relations, change the nature of the Middle East, could we be witnessing the beginning of a transformative new era in the Middle East? I know, I don't mean it's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen next year. But is this Are we in a watershed moment which would lead to radical change throughout the region?
We've been in a watershed moment, I would say, for at least a year. What happened in Syria, the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, and Syria exiting Tehran's orbit after 5 decades, was one of those moments where you felt like the Arab world is heading in a different direction. There are, of course, concerns with the current Syrian government. There's no question about that. But that was a big shift. Lebanon, getting out of the grips of Hezbollah making the ultimate political decisions in the last year has also been hugely important. And it was leading to this moment. However, it would take a lot to go right in order for that vision you're speaking of to be true. And that includes ending the occupation of Palestine. While Iran is hugely problematic and has actually done more damage to the Palestinian cause than good, there is that concern that actually, without real change in Palestine, ultimately this region will find it very difficult to live in peace. So I think that's something we shouldn't overlook. You did mention the Board of Peace.
Yep.
The Board of Peace is trying to not only, get the people of Gaza to have more stability, but ultimately to have peace. But on the table, ultimately, the 20-point plan that Donald Trump put out there speaks of Palestinian rights, but we need to have self-determination for the Palestinians. So these two cannot be separated. But for the moment, and where we are at the moment, it is about Iran making a decision to strike its neighbors. These are Arab lands. These are countries that are not involved in the war. Even the pretense that what they're targeting is bases of the U.S., these are civilian, what they've targeted so far is civilian locations and places, and the people who have died have been civilians or injured. And so I think that's the immediate thought. The long term, we all hope for a more peaceful region. It's not normal to live in a state, in a region where you have a state that can decide to, bomb countries at large. And that state is not only Iran, it's also been Israel. So we need to get out of that framework where countries can act with impunity.
Going to move in a completely different direction, if I may, and ask your opinion, Mina, about the protests in Pakistan. I mean, Pakistan is going through yet another difficult time, war with Afghanistan. Are you surprised by the level of protest we're witnessing in Pakistan? I mean, they've tried to storm the consulate in Karachi. I believe they burnt a UN office in Skardu. Are you surprised by any of that?
I'm not surprised in the sense that we've seen mass level protests in Pakistan. There are always enough groups of, frankly, mainly men who are willing to go out there and express their anger. Often that anger is looped into one. There's an anger about the state of affairs, often in their own country, but also against the U.S. And let's not forget, the U.S. has been responsible for a lot of crimes, a lot of wars that have happened in the region, and there are those that try to stoke up that sentiment against the U.S. that actually often deflects from own internal situations. I also wonder about crowd control and when protesters are allowed, so to speak, in countries like Pakistan to express themselves almost in a way of allowing people to have, let off steam, so to speak. You're right to mention Afghanistan. I mean, a couple of days ago, we were all wondering about what a war between Pakistan and Afghanistan would look like.
Final question. Were the strikes against Iran legal in your opinion? Does it matter if they weren't?
I mean, I think using the term legal, I'd have to say, the cliche of, well, it would take lawyers to look at legal. But in my mind, no, countries cannot just go out and strike other countries. That shouldn't be the world we live in, but it is the world we live in.
It is.
But also, Iran has done a lot of their own illegal undertakings in many countries of this region. So, as I said, it would be great if we lived in a world where everybody adhered to international law. But unfortunately, not only the U.S. and Israeli strikes, but there have been many strikes and attacks and assassinations and otherwise that are illegal, and we all suffer in the long term as a consequence.
Mina Al-Oraibi, pleasure talking to you, and thank you for heavily caveated views on the situation